all here. And we're especially pleased today to have a visitor who many of you have heard on the radio, but probably, perhaps few of you have met in person. And her name is Margot Adler. Margot Adler grew up in New York City and attended Berkeley in the turbulent 1960s. She was an activist in the free speech movement and was also a civil rights worker in Mississippi. In 1968, during her senior year at Berkeley, she began working in radio, starting at Pacifica's KPFA and WBAI. She says she will explain in detail later, but she says she entered radio purely by chance. But she has been at National Public Radio since 1978, so she's had a long career in radio. She's currently New York correspondent for NPR, working out of the New York Bureau. Her pieces air on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Weekend Edition. She's also the host of Justice Talking, a public radio show about law and American life, which airs on about 100 stations nationwide. She's also the author of 2 books, the first titled Drawing Down the Moon, a study of contemporary pagan nature religions, and a second book called Heretic's Heart, A Journey Through Spirit and Revolution. It's a 1960s memoir, and I actually just finished it last night, so I feel I know her a bit better. And if any of you, by the way, would like to buy the book, it is for sale. Anyway, we're just enormously pleased that she's come out to be with us today. Please welcome Margot Adler.
I'm really glad to be here. And of course, now that Penny's read the book, she not only knows me well, she knows me too well. Too well, because I probably said things there that I probably, on reflection, should not have. Let me tell you a little bit about how I got into radio, first of all. And I grew up in New York City in a fairly countercultural home. You might call it a sort of old lefty home. I went to Berkeley in the 60s, and quite frankly, if you had asked me in the fall of my senior year what I was going to do with my life, I did not have a clue. And I began to get fairly depressed about this, as I think many adolescent young women do at that time, and I had no idea. And I actually remember going to take the famous test that you take that asks you the 300 questions, would you rather file cards or cut carrots or whatever, and then they team you up with the answers from professions around the world. And you should know that the 2 professions that I had thought about seriously and rejected was, 1, psychiatry, because I came from this big psychiatric family. I'm the granddaughter of Alfred Adler. And my father was a psychiatrist. He's dead now. My aunt was a psychiatrist. Everybody in that part of the family was a psychiatrist. And so that was obviously sort of the family business that I, in some way, rejected by not taking a single psychology course in college. And then the other profession was music. I had been a voice student at the High School of Music and Art and had sung in millions of choruses and madrigal groups and so forth. So I went and took this test, and I came out of the test, and they gave me the results, and some counselor who had never seen me before in her life, of course, because we're talking about a university of 27,000 at the time, I walked in and she handed my results, and there were the results, and it said, 1, musician, 2, psychiatrist, 3, music teacher, 4, psychologist, and then everything else was like way down there, and I thought, I'm 21 and I've ruined my life already, Anyway, so I had no idea after, and then, that I met with some counselor who told me, had no advice for me whatsoever. And I went home, I was extremely depressed, and I turned on the radio a couple of mornings later. And I was listening to Pacifica, which was the KPFA Pacifica station there. And there was a man on the radio, I will never forget it, his name was Don Porcher. He was the news director of KPFA. and he was reading George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, which is an extraordinary essay about propaganda and the way words are used and language and so forth. And after he read this essay, he said he was looking for volunteers because he had a belief about the way words should be used in news, and that things should be called by their real meaning. And that we lived in a society, remember this is the height of the Vietnam War, this is the fall of 67, winter of 68, and all the headlines are, you know, Soviet snoop ship seen in waters, the Red Chinese, etc. And he was saying, well, we call the Chinese, and if we're going to do a story about a possible intelligence vessel that is for the Soviet Union, we call it that. And I was just totally taken with this. I thought, wow, this has to do with truth, it has to do with, you know, integrity. I was scared out of my mind, but I called him up, you know, and I said, yes, I'd like to volunteer. And I had no journalism, I'd taken one journalism course in college, which was only because it was given by the son of Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker who wrote The Shame of the Cities. It was Peter Steffens, and I thought that would be interesting. And I had 3 failed weeks on the paper where I realized I could not write ad copy. And so I went in and I started volunteering, and I started sort of cutting wire copy and rewriting news stories and so forth. And finally, after about 6 months, I had a tape of 7 minutes of me reading the news on the air, and I graduated, and I went back to New York. And of course, I got a job coding survey somewhere, got some, sort of entry-level jobs. I didn't have the courage inside of me to walk into a radio station, or even to walk into the Pacifica radio station in New York and say, hire me. Finally, I finally went to the New York station, the New York Pacific station, with my 7 minutes of tape. And I think I'm telling this story because we live in a culture right now where it's assumed that you have to have degrees for everything. And yet if you look at who works for NPR, the old-timers, none of that was true. Neil Conan never graduated from college. Nina Totenberg, you think she went to law school? No way. No way. I mean, this is, it was a very different time, and you didn't have to feel that you went through this sort of straight and narrow route to get to where you were. So I walked in there with my little tape, and I said hi, and I talked to the program director, who began to play footsies with me under the table at the great radical WBAI in 1968, and told me that women did not do news because their voices were too high. My voice was higher in 40 years ago, but it wasn't high, right? Anyway, but I was willing to work for nothing, which is something that I think students now also are not willing to do in a certain way. I think there's a sense of entitlement now about going through college and getting there, and so I ended up being a volunteer. I went through my regular job till 5, came there and volunteered in the news department until at night, and they finally offered me $85 a week to basically work and be a newscaster, and that's how I sort of started out in radio. And very soon after that, I suddenly decided, because as a woman, I think I didn't have a lot of confidence, and I didn't have a lot of, I think like many women, I didn't feel very confident about myself. I felt, well, maybe I should go to school and learn about this since I'm doing it. So finally I went to Columbia School of Journalism for a year. Not that I learned anything really that great, and then things started happening. I started covering the Panther trial, I went to Washington. I walked in my 3rd day on the job in Washington covering Congress for Pacifica, and there, sitting in the next room, who had rented half of our office, was Seymour Hersh. And Seymour Hersh had just broken the My Lai story. And I looked at this man in total awe, and he looked at me, and he said, "What are you doing here? You're the kind of person who would probably go to the White House and ask mealy-mouthed questions." And of course, being new on the job, I thought, he was probably right. And I gained 25 pounds in about 3 weeks, right? But anyway, and then how did I get to NPR from all of this? Well, I worked for Pacifica for a long while. I ended up doing freeform radio, which is my greatest love. And then through crazy, fluky things, I ended up being, we were 12 of us seized the station during one of those crises at Pacifica. Anyway, that's a long story. I can answer a question if you want that. But anyway, and so a year went by. I had a book contract. I was writing a book, and I got called up by Pacifica and asked to fundraise for one of their interminable marathons. And I said, oh, well, you're the only game in town still, I'll do it. And sitting next to me was a man I had worked with at Pacifica named Neil Conan. And Neil Conan said to me, would you like to go out for a beer? This is how it really works. You think it's resumes, right? He said, would you like to go out for a beer? I said, yeah. He said, what are you doing? I said, well, you know, I used to work here. I'm now writing a book. I don't know what I'm doing, but what are you doing? He said, well, I work for this program called All Things Considered. I said, really? I had actually never heard it. To me, at that point in my revolutionary life, well, NPR was sort of state radio. I kind of looked down on it. I thought it was very negative at that point in 1977 when I talked to him, 1978. But he said, come and freelance, and I've been there ever since. And that's how I ended up at Pacifica. I think I want to talk a little bit about radio and why radio, what radio I think does for our community. I mean, I should say that National Public Radio now is very different than it was when I came there in 1978. When I came there in 1978, there was one show, All Things Considered. And if you said to somebody, particularly in New York City, that you were doing a story and you wanted to interview them for NPR, no one knew what you were talking about. There were some cities in the U.S. where even then they knew what you were talking about. Cambridge, you know, Madison, Wisconsin. But most places really had not heard, and the listening audience for NPR was actually quite small. Now when you have like 26 million over a week, it's a huge enterprise. And it's become, I think, you know, much more mainstream, much more corporate in a certain sense, much more almost like the New York Times of the air. And there are very good things about that in the sense, and there are some things that I regret about that in the sense that some of the quirky, crazy, bizarre 20-minute pieces on pirate radio, being in an isolation tank and talking about what that experience was like, the kind of quirky, bizarre things that I did in 1978 and 1979 are harder, I think, to get on the air today. And because there's now such a far-flung, huge cast of correspondents, and there's a determination to cover the world in a way that wasn't done then, those amazing 17-minute, bizarre, slightly maybe needing a little more editing stories that we did in the early 80s, the mid-80s or so forth, now are like 4.5-minute pieces because, you know, you have the piece from Iraq and the piece from Afghanistan and the piece from Italy and so forth and so on. And so it's a very different kind of operation than it was at that time. I think that what it does give is it gives a way of basically being at home in the world for thousands of people. And so I go through, and I'm sure some of you who are avid listeners go through this, but I go through this very often. As someone who works there, I see all the seamy side. So I can go on my, I'm really angry about this about NPR, and oh, they shouldn't have covered this way, and oh, I'm really angry about this. And then I go to visit my husband's relatives in Salt Lake City, and suddenly NPR is scintillating. It's intellectually the most important thing after I've sat through a Thanksgiving dinner. Suddenly, it's like, oh, how could I have said this about NPR? It's like the best thing in the world. And so at this point in my life, I definitely have that kind of complicated relationship with the station depending where I am and when I am. Interestingly, my husband, who is what would I call him? He's an academic without portfolio. He's a writer and a sort of intellectual, but he's, only published a couple things or whatever, and he's not, it's a sad state of affairs that I'm the main wage earner in New York City working for public radio, but, Anyway, he, after 9/11, he had many people, I would say we all reacted to 9/11 in very personal, complicated ways, but his way was to, besides getting totally paranoid on some issues, was to become obsessed with foreign news. to such an extent that he went on the internet. His French and his German, which had, of course, atrophied from years and years of unuse and since college, and he started reading and reading and reading, subscribing to TV5, to Deutsche Welle, listening to German news, listening to French news, you know, subscribing on the internet to Al Jazeera in English, you know, I mean, going completely crazy. I mean, you know, but getting, you know, suddenly getting aware of the world in a way that I think is, you know, in reflection, even though I think he went a little overboard, was very important, I think. And I think to some extent what NPR does do for most of the world is it does a little version of that. And when I wake up in the morning and, let's say, take a taxi cab, and now in New York City, if you get into a cab in the morning, 9 times out of 10, used to be, you know, Howard Stern, used to be, you know, 9 times out of 10, it's an immigrant cab driver listening to the BBC or listening to NPR. 9 times out of 10. And I think that really says something really interesting about who we are and you know, and what's happening in our society. Let me talk about a couple of things that I think are interesting issues about going on with radio and with journalism in general right now. The journalism is, we're in a very complicated place, I think, right now as far as journalism. Journalism's under attack, certainly in a big way. In some cases, maybe it should be. But in some cases, it's been much too cozy with power and with officials and stuff like that. I think 10 years ago, we would never have thought to have an ombudsman at NPR or at the New York Times. There are now ethics codes in journalism, some of which I think are questionable. It is now absolutely, we are not, as journalists, not supposed to be a member of anything. You're not supposed to be a member of the ACLU, the Sierra Club, any of that, as if we checked our citizenship at the door. I'm not sure that's right. I'm not sure I believe that that's an appropriate stance. I personally think that the whole notion of objectivity is erroneous, and that instead we should be fair and be above ground and totally forthright with what our biases are, and only by eliciting and elucidating those biases do we actually have the possibility of being fair, instead of pretending to an objectivity that most of us don't really actually even, mostly we think we're objective when we're really not, because we haven't considered so many other things. I mean, I agree with some of it. I agree we shouldn't give to campaigns, fine, great, but then of course everybody's husband gives to campaigns, or wives give to campaigns, so it's all bogus, right? It's all, doesn't really mean anything. There are now so many possibilities for expanding our world via radio. How many of you, does anybody here have an internet radio? Any of you even, you do? It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, you can basically put your genre in and get music from wherever you want or all over the world incredibly easily. When in Washington there was a big fight recently because WIDA went back to classical music. And I kept on saying, that's such a short-sighted view. Why do you care about it? This is probably going to get me people will probably object to this, but there's a part of me that thinks, why should you have a local classical music station? My husband listens to, you know, Radio Bartok from Bulgaria or Hungary, and radio this, you know, I mean, he says WNYC, I don't like their selections at all. I'll go to Radio Netherlands, I'll go to RAI in Italy, and, you know, so I think we have an incredible possibility for opening up to the world. Satellite radio, of course, is, I have satellite radio as well, internet radio as well. I think there are all these possibilities to make the world come to us in a really important way. But I think what I really want to talk about before I open it up and just take questions and let the discussion go wherever you want it to go. The thing about radio is, I think that it is a completely limitless medium. And what I think I want to do is I want to read you a passage from Heretic's Heart, which is this memoir I wrote, which is really, call it a 60s memoir, but it's really sort of 50s, 60s, 70s memoir. And I just want to read you a passage about what radio felt like when I first got involved, and why I think it is the medium of the imagination, in the same way that books are the medium of imagination, but unlike, let's say, television, because you essentially write the pictures with your mind in the same way that you write the pictures with your mind in books. And so, let me find this little, where did I put this? Here it is. So I thought what I'd do is I'd read you this passage, and because I think that one of the things that I'm sort of sad about is that I don't think that anybody in radio, including NPR, maybe internet radio, maybe small little low-powered radio stations, are doing some of the creative, imaginative things that used to be done, with the exception of certain things like Radio Lab. Many of you have been hearing Robert Krulwich and Radio Lab. I mean, extraordinary, totally extraordinary. But that's such a small thing. That's like, that's what, 10 programs a year or something like that they do. And it's very produced. So there's very little spontaneous, incredibly creative. Everything is very formalized. If you listen to Terry Gross, you think that that's spontaneous. It is so edited. It is so meticulously edited. It is shocking. Having substitute hosted Fresh Air twice, I will tell you, it is very, very controlled. And so I am looking at that spark that I felt in the early 70s, mid-70s, that was possible, and hoping that that will be done again by a younger generation that is getting into radio now. So I want to read you this little section. It's 5 a.m. at the radio station. I'm sitting in almost total darkness, watching the dials in my solitary rocket ship. And that was because I hosted my own show. I was the engineer, and so I went to the station and turned it on in the morning. And I was the only person there. This was at BAI in 1972, 3, 4. It's easiest to invoke the dream state in this darkness that mimics the starry night, where instead of the points of light from planets and stars, the lights are the buttons and dials of this radio studio, where I sit alone, the captain and engineer of this ship that makes a 2-hour journey every morning. My rocket is named Hour of the Wolf, and just like the Enterprise, its mission is to explore new worlds. And in sadder, more reflective moments, I think that despite the moon landing and the hopes it raised, this is the closest I will get to other planets in my lifetime. The early hours of the morning, when most people are asleep and few are listening, and those that are awake may still be half in dream and reverie, allow conversations that would never even begin later in the day. During these hours, people are willing to reveal their deepest hopes and fears in a state of innocence. The radio can allow imagination and fantasy to soar, perhaps by encouraging the same intimacy, imagined or real, that Mark and I, this soldier in Vietnam that half the book is about, 9 letters there, created in those letters that crossed from Berkeley to Vietnam and back. The thing about radio, as Tony Schwartz, the public relations genius, once said, is that people were born without earlids. Unlike television pictures, sound flows all around us, and the flood of images that come to us from these sounds is in large part our own creation. Today we live in a world of strident talk shows, where received opinions on the state of the world are trumpeted back and forth, and anyone who might dare to unfurl a hope is quickly put down. But at WBAI-FM in the early 70s, a period of wild and wonderful experimentation in freeform radio, pioneers like Bob Fass and Steve Post and Liza Cowan and others could open the phone lines and just let people talk, never screening a single call. I've been given this 2-hour slot because no one else is using it, and I don't yet have the chutzpah to ask for anything better. But here I am, free to try my hand while I live on an unemployment check of $32 a week. If the show's a success, WBAI will hire me back. At 5 in the morning, there's nothing that cannot be changed. Mostly there are questions and feelings and yearnings. Anything can happen. A story is read on the air, an interview is conducted, the phone lines are opened, and anyone can turn the world upside down or at least change the ship's course. A cab driver begins a show by talking about the day that passed. A science fiction story prompts a discussion of utopian and dystopian ideas. A woman reads a document called the Asexual Manifesto on the air, and calls from the solitary and celibate follow for days. Or I close my eyes and speak into the ether about my ambivalence about having children, my fear that I will be trapped in a system I've always avoided, and that my need to be accepted will triumph over my need for freedom, that I'll be transformed into a Stepford wife, that having been an only child, I haven't learned how to take care of a child. The letters pour in, and I read them on the air, and the talk continues. Women call up with babies wailing in the background. Some talk of the unexpected wonder of their children, the joy of participating in life and community, while others dare to ponder if they've made a mistake. Against this explosion of variety, amidst this explosion of variety, is there any order? Very few things seem evil, except apathy. That which aids potential is good, and that which limits it is evil. Creative order is good, as is creative disorder, as Robert Anton Wilson once said. Destructive order and destructive disorder are bad. So I would let this go anywhere you want. You can talk about NPR, you can ask questions, go say your statements, whatever.
Do you think there's been a change in the programming in NPR in the last year or so? To some purposes, I mostly listen to the radio in the car. And because I work sometimes it's not one time a day I listen. And it seems to me that NPR has gotten very hooked on the top story of the day. In other words, no matter what time of day, for a week I turn it on, I'm hearing about, the medical treatment for soldiers, which of course is important, but it seemed to me a couple of years ago, you would get so many varied stories. It didn't have to be front page, it could be back page, it could be last week's. So, do you think there's been a change?
I think that there have been many changes. I don't know if there's been what I would call a huge change in the last year. I think that there has been a number of things happening. I think that there is a determination to be more news-oriented, definitely. I think there's no question about that. I think that they see, it used to be when I started out at NPR, that NPR was seen as the place you went for background, you went for analysis, you went for et cetera, that it wasn't your only source. Now I think they feel there are many people where NPR is their primary source of everything. And so there is a feeling clearly on some of the parts of the people who are sort of the head of the news managing team that they need to be everything for everybody. We may wish it different, but I think that's what they feel. The second thing that's happening right now is they're all petrified about the internet. They're all petrified about digital media. They're petrified about, how would I say this? They all are worried that young people, that the new generation is going to abandon newspapers, abandon radio, abandon all the major forms of news. So there's this huge push to be on every platform, as it's said, to be available on cell phones, to be available on podcasting. So there's much more, emphasis on that kind of thing. And then I think the third thing is that there's somewhat of a state of, and this is not a new thing, this has been going on, I used to say this 15 years ago. I mean, it started maybe 15, 20 years ago. You have a group of very hardworking, burnt-out people who mostly live in Washington, D.C. And so their world is very much Washington, D.C. And so, whereas for someone sitting in Southampton or in Phoenix, the primary story might not be Walter Reed after 2 days. Their world is very much politics, Congress, etc. They go to the morning meeting, they sit there, and what's in front of them? The Washington Post and the New York Times. And so without, I I don't think it's an obvious thing, I think it's very subtle. But if you every day are burnt out and working hard and your news, and you're living in Washington and you're reading the Washington Post and the New York Times, and those are your most primary sources of information, that very subtly you begin thinking that's the world. And even though you will go to meetings and say, we've got to broaden out and we really want to make sure that the rest of the world is covered and this, that, and the other, on some level you're very influenced by that mindset. And I think that's been true for the last that's been true for a long while. That's not new.
Yes, you talked about there having editing for the talk shows. I'm wondering if you can just give me some information about how they screen their callers, and it seems as though
I don't think they screen that much. I don't think there's a huge screening of callers. I think they do try to get different areas of the country.
Mm-hmm.
They clearly try to get different areas of the country. They clearly try to get different, men, women, they try to, et cetera. I don't think, when I say that Terry Gross is very edited, I want to be very careful about that. What I mean is that, I don't mean that there's a lot of censorship. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is that it's not just sitting and having a conversation. It's thinking, well, how should I begin this segment of the program? How should this segment of the program end? It's having a sense of form that is very much programmed into it. So it's not just like having a really interesting conversation with somebody. It's thought about in terms of, this is a 15-minute segment, let's think about how we're going to ask that. And then things that don't really work in that form might get cut out in that sense. So that's what I mean by it's very edited. When I substitute hosted, I think I came with somewhat of a chip on my shoulder, admittedly. I had certain things I wanted to do. I wanted to get this book done, and I wanted to, and I got shot down by a lot of my ideas got shot down. And I went back, and a month later, this is like 4 years ago, and then a month later, I substitute hosted in All Things Considered, and I came with the same book. 2 seconds later, that book was done. And so now, admittedly, one reason may have been they didn't know me and trust me on Fresh Air. They'd never seen me as a substitute host. They knew me at National NPR. They were going to trust my judgment on some level. So that may have also been a factor, But I was surprised that it wasn't just as kind of open-ended as I thought it was going to be. I think that's really what I'm saying. Yes.
You and Steve Post were certainly my two favorites on BAI.
Oh.
You had no desire to follow him or to go with him to NYC or at that time?
It never occurred to me to go. I was already at NPR, and I didn't want to. He was really hosting classical music and doing it his own way, and I was, on NYC. It never occurred to me, actually, to go to NYC. At one point, I had some preliminary discussions with the station manager to host a woman-oriented program there, but nothing ever came of it. No, it didn't. And I still, I love Steve Post.
Me too.
I love Steve Post.
And the Williams all over too.
Yes.
A number of years ago, I was divorced, living alone, and very alone. I have to go. And Steve Post became my husband. I woke up and Steve Post was there, and Steve Post was a wonderful husband. I remember one day driving to work, and I was feeling very low, and Steve Post said he was having a very difficult day. He'd gotten up in the morning, he'd taken off his clothes, he'd gotten in the shower, and he'd forgotten what to do. Then one time he said, Mozart wrote this when he was 7. What were you doing when you were 7? It was wonderful, absolutely wonderful.
It's like the old Tom Lehrer joke. When Mozart was my age, he'd been dead 2 years. He said when he was 35, right? But Steve Post, I think
absolutely wonderful.
I think that what these free-form radio people, Larry Josephson, Steve Post, Paul Gorman to some extent, a lot of these people who were around and who are not there now. That kind of programming really does not exist in our culture right now. That kind of using your personal life as a sort of way to get into everybody's life and to deal with questions like, what is community? do we feel alienated at work? What are our lives like? Those questions are not questions that get dealt with on the radio anymore. And Steve was incredible. I have a Steve story like that too. I was extremely, before I went to BAI, I remember listening at 2 in the morning or something when he was on way late at night, and he was talking about going to Scotland and some story about meeting this farmer and sheep. I don't even remember it. I remember I was rolling on the floor. I was just laughing and laughing, and my whole mood had changed because this man had essentially made me whole again. It was really, really amazing. So I can understand that Steve Post was your husband.
Right now, NPR is my family, very much my family.
Like, continuing on that theme, I work alone. I work in a big old house down on the beach, and I've worked there for 25 years. And my best friends are the people on NPR. And I'm sure for many people that spend much of their time alone, these are the only people. You guys are the only people that might talk to me certain days. So you have a big impact.
Well, that's amazing to hear in a way, because the feeling I had when I went from Pacifica to NPR was that while I did some really wonderful pieces that I loved, I spent, I remember doing a 20-minute piece on just being with AIDS counselors in San Francisco and what that experience was like, and that was one of the few pieces where I got, 70 letters, just amazing, and I would just sit and look at these letters and start crying just from the letters. But very often, you can work in NPR, and the only letter you'll get is, you pronounced Beijing incorrectly, Whereas in fact, the letters, when I had only maybe 50,000 people listening to me on Pacifica, the depth of the response was deeper, because the freedom of my own response was deeper. Yes?
I imagine that there's a shift in the funding of NPR. I'm not sure if I'm right, but it seems like the government's less, the people are less, the corporations are more. Has that affected news content? And is there a way for people to, I don't have deep pockets, but is there a way for people to reclaim what the corporates are doing? Is there a discussion about that?
The funding change that happened, which has the term of unbundling, basically is that the government was less and the stations were more. I mean, there is most of the money comes from the stations that pay huge fees to get NPR programming. WNYC pays like $3 million. I mean, huge amounts of money, and they raise money. They pay huge amounts of money. So what that means is that NPR is beholden much more, national NPR, to the stations. Because it is the stations. Yes, there's there's always been corporate funding, and there is corporate funding, but the real thing is that the stations have a lot more power, and so what the stations want. And the stations, most of the stations, for example, want 24-hour newscasts, and they want certain things that are not necessarily what you and I might want. And so a lot of station pressure has changed what NPR is about. There's a lot of rap corporate, but actually the corporate stuff is a lot more subtle and not quite it's not in your face in the way that station power really is, and large station power, successful large station power, WGB, has much more effect, I think, on NPR's sound and NPR's direction.
Who runs the stations?
Well, who runs the stations? Depends on the station,
It's not cooperative.
Oh, well, they're usually, they basically are listener-based and funding-based. Laura Walker, for example, is the station manager at WNYC, on and on and on. Now, remember, WNYC used to be a city station, used to be owned by the city, and then remember, bunches of people spent years essentially raising funds to make it independent, and now it's independent. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what a huge group of stations wants for the world, because You know, they have their demands, they have their breaks at 20, they have their this, that, and the other, so we'd like you to change all things considered to have this break here or that break there. You know, in other words, a lot of formatting decisions can be based on what stations think they need.
First I want to say thank you for coming and speaking with us. It's really a thrill. But I wanted to ask you about what a radio lab is. I'm not familiar with this terminology.
Oh, Radiolab is a program that is done out of WNYC. It's called Radiolab. It's done by Robert Krulwich and, who's the other guy? He's fabulous. But they do it very produced. It's sort of experimental radio where they use sound in really creative and unusual ways. I forget even what time it's on, they don't do, it's not every week because they really work on these experimental sound portraits and something like that. I mean, I think that, you know, another program that's very formatted but very fabulous is This American Life on PRI. I mean, it's incredible, but it's very, 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 very crafted. You know, it is, they get lots of entries, they reject lots of entries, they work with producers enormously. It's almost like a play in some way. It is a play. I mean, they have acts, you know. I mean, it's done like a play with rehearsals and stuff like that, so it's a very crafted. So I would say there's much more formality and format and much less spontaneity, but that doesn't mean there isn't brilliant radio going on.
But it's like tightrope walking. I mean, tightrope walking, the person can make it look so easy. So
Yes, it does look
the
amazing.
amount of artistry
It's
it
incredible.
takes to make something look easy.
Yes, and as a matter of fact, they have, This American Life actually publishes a little book called How to Make Radio. And I think you can send for it. And it basically, it's a cartoon booklet, but basically shows how they go through making their show. And it's quite an amazing little booklet. I think, you probably can call them up and send for it, whatever, but it's pretty amazing. Yes?
I was just gonna say that, the show that's been going on for so long also was, you know, Prairie Home Companion. Are you familiar with any of the people who work on that, or?
You know, one of the sort of best kept secrets about public radio is that there are two totally competing and in some ways adversary groups in public radio. Everybody thinks it's one thing,
Yeah.
and just like everybody thinks that somehow PBS and NPR have some relationship to each other, which they don't. But PRI, which does Prairie Home Companion and This American Life, is not NPR. It's Public Radio International out of Minneapolis. And it's very easy to not notice that. It's very easy not to notice where anything is coming from, to not realize that, you know, the shows are coming from Washington, or that you might have a local Morning Edition person who says he's the host of Morning Edition, but he really lives in Connecticut, or he really, you know, there's all kinds of, you have to listen very closely to actually figure out half of what's happening.
I would like to say that it's through NPR and BBC that I have developed a little bit more of an awareness of an Arabic point of view than was ever available to people in America years ago. And that's been a positive thing rather than the negative. We're talking about, gee, things are just not the same anymore. You could do this, you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
But in that one
Yes,
area,
that's true.
truth about, or some, let's say, some truth.
Certain aspects of the
things.
multi-truths that exist in our world.
Are finally making
Yeah.
us more aware of a Beirut, of a Baghdad, and the human side of things than used to exist years ago. And the other quick question I wanted to ask was, on a BAI, when you get the call-ins and everything, how much is done to edit that?
Nothing.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I don't know now. Now it's
It doesn't-
completely different. Remember, when I was at Pacifica, it was a very different Pacifica than it exists now. It was, first of all, it was much less ideological in some way at the beginning, certainly in the early 70s. It was also much less third world, you know. I mean, now it's a much more multicultural, multiracial. You know, that's the other thing you hear. You hear a lot of African American cab drivers listening to BAI. Whereas when I was, you know, in the 70s, that was not true. It was a lot of it was a white boys radio, you know, with a few women thrown in, and that's really shifted. And you know, so you can say that part of the reason that freeform radio ended to a certain extent was there was a philosophical shift that happened at Pacifica. You know, it's a very different place now than it was. So, you know, I don't know where I'm going with that.
Well, I just feel that,
But at that point, we didn't even put 7 seconds. Sometimes we wouldn't even put the 7-second delay in, and then we sometimes got into trouble with the FCC. I once got I actually got censored by, you know, had an FCC note in my file because I once, you know, I was a board engineer, you know, besides doing, I had to make some money because they didn't pay me for my freeform show, so I was in, you know, I would be a board announcer, you know. And there was a religion show that some of you may remember by Les Hickson years and years ago. It was a very, very interesting religion show. And they had some guru come in for 2 hours, and I thought to myself, oh, it's a guru. How safe can that be? I'll go and just have a cup of coffee and not really listening to it, instead of doing what I was supposed to do, monitoring the air, you know. And he started saying, when you bleep, I can't even begin to tell you, but he used the F word maybe 25 times. And I was completely oblivious. Totally. I was like in another room. I was like talking to someone, you know, and it was not a delay or anything like that because I just assumed it's a religion program, right? You know, and this guy got on and just started doing this, and some, of course, at that very moment, of course, some poor guy was in his car with his 7-year-old kid, you know, and the next thing that I knew is I had a letter in my file saying that I had abrogated this, that, and the other. And
well, I just admire the interviewers for their ability to deal with that, you know, and come across fairly objectively and,
yeah,
you know, not turn somebody right off. It doesn't feel so much like, they usually come across as unbiased, or if they have a point of view, they are willing to hear your point of view, that kind of thing. I think it's good.
well, you know, I have to let me end with this, and then we can, or whatever. But I had one experience. Only once in my life was I called. Well, maybe I'm not talking about moderating an interview, but once in a piece that I did. Only once was I accused of bias, and it was a very early lesson, and it completely changed my view about everything. I did a piece called, it was at Pacifica, and I did a piece about the environment and about companies that tried to use the environment to sort of make ads about how great they were in dealing with the environment, when in fact they probably weren't so great. And I interviewed this woman who was with the Glass Manufacturing Something of America. And I did this little trick after her. I put a little musical fillip into the dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, which sort of dissed her. You know, it sort of made her not really be taken seriously. And she called me up and she said, you know, you biased everything. And, you know, and she was right. She was absolutely right. And it was a very, you know, this was in 1972, you know, it was a long time ago. And it really affected me, and I started elucidating some principles about what I really believe you're supposed to do when you interview somebody. And what you're supposed to do, this is something I believe, it's a pact. You make a silent pact with the person you interview. And that silent pact goes something like this. I'm going to interview you for, you know, 35 minutes, or whatever. And I'm going to cut you down to like, you know, I don't know, 5 minutes, 4 minutes, who knows. And when you listen to that interview, you're going to say, oh, you got all my main points. Did you really edit me? that was exactly, you actually got all my main points. And that is what your goal is with every single interview. That you stand inside their shoes, you represent them as they want to be represented themselves. And that's what that doesn't mean that you yourself doesn't have a point of view, that you know, but when you are representing them, you are inside their shoes and you make a pact with them that they are going to be as they are and as they would like to be. And that, I think, is a lesson I learned in '72, and I have tried never to violate it.
Thank you.
I think this is a good note to end on. We're so happy to have people like you, not people like you, but you actually. On the radio that we've listened to, now we know a little bit better, Margot, and I admire you, and I'm sure all of us admire you. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you all.